The weight of justice. The rain poured down in heavy sheets, blurring the neon lights of the city into streaks of color against the darkened sky. The rhythmic drumming against the windshield was the only sound in the car besides the steady breathing of Judge Amara Ellis. She sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her reflection stared back at her from the rearview mirror, dark eyes sharp with determination, lips pressed into a firm line. Tonight was the beginning of everything. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, for the day she would walk into the hallowed halls of the Madison County Courthouse, not as a law student, not as an attorney, but as Judge Ellis, the first black female judge to preside over its courtrooms. Her mother's old ID badge, faded and cracked with time, hung from the rearview mirror. It was more than just a piece of laminated plastic. It was a symbol, a reminder of the price her family had paid to get here. "I made it, Mama," she whispered, brushing her fingers over the image of her mother's warm smile. Her mother had been wrongfully convicted 15 years ago, dragged through a corrupt legal system that crushed her beneath the weight of its power. Amara had been just a teenager when she watched her mother disappear behind the bars of an unjust prison sentence, powerless to stop it. Not anymore. Amara inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle over her, before finally pulling the car door open and stepping into the storm. The cold wind lashed against her soaked blazer, her heels clicking purposefully against the pavement as she strode toward the courthouse entrance. Each step was a declaration of war against the very system that had taken everything from her. As she approached the heavy glass doors, she could already feel the stares. The courthouse security detail stood like statues near the entrance, their eyes locked onto her as she neared. The first guard, an older white man with graying temples, barely glanced up from his phone. "Defendants way outside," he grunted, gesturing vaguely toward the benches near the entrance without even looking at her. Amara stopped in her tracks, rain dripping from her blazer as she pulled her credentials from her pocket. "I'm Judge Amara Ellis," she stated firmly, holding up her official badge. "Today is my first day." For the first time, the older guard actually looked at her, his expression twisting into something unreadable. "You're a judge?" he asked, his tone skeptical. The second guard, a younger man with a shaved head, stepped forward before she could respond. "You sure about that?" he scoffed, crossing his arms. "Judges don't walk in through the front like this." Amara's grip tightened on her badge. "And yet, here I am." The first guard scratched the side of his face, shaking his head. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this entrance isn't for. I don't think you understand." She cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice through the rain-soaked air. "I am Judge Ellis. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with the presiding judge." A tense silence stretched between them, the rain still pounding against the pavement. Amara stood her ground, refusing to flinch beneath their scrutiny. Then, a frantic voice cut through the moment. "Judge Ellis." "My apologies, Judge Ellis." A young woman, no older than 25, came rushing toward them, a stack of files clutched against her chest. She was out of breath, her short curls bouncing as she skidded to a stop beside Amara. "Judge Whitmore has been expecting you in his chambers." Both guards stiffened, their eyes widening as realization dawned. The older one cleared his throat, suddenly flustered. "Of course, ma'am. No problem. Right this way." The younger guard, the one who had grabbed her arm moments earlier, took a cautious step back. Amara gave them one last, unreadable look before turning to follow the young woman. She didn't need to say anything. The damage had already been done. As they walked through the grand marble-floored hallway, the young woman glanced up at her nervously. "I'm Valerie Carter," she introduced herself, still slightly out of breath. "Your assistant." "Assistant?" Amara raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Judge Whitmore assigned me to assist with your transition." Valerie bit her lip. "I've heard what happened just now, with security. I'm so sorry." Amara exhaled, shaking off the lingering frustration. "It's fine. It won't be the last time someone underestimates me. Valerie hesitated before responding. Still, it was wrong. They turned the corner, heading toward the judge's chambers. The courthouse was massive. Tall ceilings, grand staircases, and thick wooden doors that held decades of power behind them. Amara could feel the history pressing down on her, the weight of all the judges who had come before her. Most of them had been old white men. Now things were changing. As they approached Judge Whitmore's office, Valerie knocked once before pushing open the door. The presiding judge sat behind a massive oak desk, his graying hair neatly combed, his dark suit immaculate. He was well into his 60s, his expression carefully neutral as Amara entered. "Well," he mused, standing as she approached. "You certainly made an entrance." Amara met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't planning on making one." Whitmore chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "You'll find that people don't always take kindly to change, Judge Ellis." "I'm used to it," she said simply. Whitmore studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're going to have your work cut out for you here. Madison County has a long history of doing things a certain way." "I'm not here to maintain history," she replied, her tone measured. "I'm here to make sure justice is actually served." His lips twitched at that. "We'll see how long that fire lasts." Amara didn't blink. "As long as it needs to." Whitmore gestured toward a stack of case files on his desk. "Your docket is already full. I took the liberty of assigning you a mix of cases, some easy, some not." She stepped forward, flipping through the files. Drug possession, assault, fraud, and then something caught her eye, an old case file tucked beneath the rest. The name made her breath hitch. Edward Finch, a familiar name, a man involved in one of the cases that had led to her mother's wrongful conviction. Her fingers hovered over the file before Whitmore cleared his throat. "Careful where you step, Judge Ellis," he warned, his voice low. "Not every case is as simple as it looks." Amara met his gaze once more. There was something behind his words, something unspoken. "Neither am I," she replied. She closed the file and straightened her blazer. Her first day wasn't over yet, and this courthouse had no idea what was coming. A system designed to break you. Amara Ellis sat in her new chambers, fingers trailing the polished wood of the judge's bench as she scanned the towering stack of case files in front of her. The leather chair beneath her was firm, unfamiliar, yet she already felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. From the humiliating moment at the courthouse entrance to Judge Whitmore's thinly veiled warnings, Amara had already seen more of the system's rot than most judges would admit. This wasn't just about her stepping into a new role. It was about stepping into a battlefield where justice was more of an illusion than a reality. She sighed, rubbing her temple before picking up the case file that had stood out to her earlier. Edward Finch. She hadn't heard that name in years. Finch had been an integral part of the case that had led to her mother's wrongful conviction, a key witness, or rather, a manufactured witness who had provided a fabricated testimony. His words had sealed her mother's fate, ensuring she spent 15 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. And now Finch was back in the system, this time on the other side of the bench. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she flipped through the file, her assistant, Valerie, appeared at the doorway, her dark curls bouncing slightly as she shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Ellis," she said, stepping inside and holding out a thick manila envelope. "This just came in. From the courthouse archives." Amara took the envelope, setting it on her desk without looking at it. "Valerie, what do you know about Edward Finch?" Valerie hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the stack of files. "Convicted of fraud 5 years ago. Released on parole last year. Now he's facing new charges. Embezzlement and obstruction of justice." Amara tapped her finger against the file. "Who's prosecuting?" "District Attorney Charles Beckett," Valerie answered, her tone cautious. "And the defense attorney is Darren Langley." Amara's jaw clenched. Langley, one of the courthouse's top defense attorneys. and also one of Judge Whitmore's close allies. The game was becoming clear. Finch wasn't just another defendant. He was a pawn. She exhaled slowly, flipping open the file. The evidence against him was stacked high, too high. It was almost too perfect. Everything from phone records to fraudulent bank transactions painted him as guilty beyond a doubt, which meant it was too clean, too orchestrated. Her stomach twisted. She knew this move well. The system had a way of eating its own when they outlived their usefulness. And now, Edward Finch was being swallowed whole. Valerie cleared her throat. I also did some digging on your docket. She hesitated before continuing. A lot of your assigned cases have patterns. Amara raised an eyebrow. Patterns. Valerie stepped closer, setting a second stack of files on the desk. 32% of your cases involve repeat offenders who had past dealings with Judge Langston. 40% involve questionable plea deals. And at least a dozen cases involve individuals who were initially represented by public defenders with unusually high conviction rates. Amara's blood ran cold. She hadn't even stepped into her first trial, and already the corruption was tightening around her like a noose. This isn't coincidence, she murmured. No, it's not, Valerie agreed. There was a long silence before Valerie added, Judge Whitmore's watching you. Amara met her gaze. I know. Valerie shifted. Beckett and Langley are powerful. They control the courthouse in ways most people don't see. If Finch was useful to them once, they might be trying to get rid of him before he talks. Amara leaned back in her chair, studying the ceiling for a long moment before turning back to the case file. Then let's find out what he knows. A dangerous courtroom. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Attorneys, clerks, and even a few reporters filled the benches. This wasn't just a standard hearing. People were watching, waiting. Amara entered the courtroom, her black robe settling around her like armor. Every eye followed her as she took her place at the bench. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his deep voice carrying through the room. Edward Finch sat at the defense table, his thinning blonde hair slicked back, his pale face drawn and weary. His fingers fidgeted nervously against the table, betraying his anxiety. Across from him, D.A. Beckett sat with his usual arrogance, his crisp suit unwrinkled, his expression a mask of confidence. And then there was Langley. Darren Langley leaned back in his chair, his arms casually draped over the armrests. His smirk was faint but present, as though he already knew how this would end. Amara scanned the courtroom before speaking. Mr. Finch, you are charged with embezzlement and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Finch hesitated, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Not guilty, Your Honor. His voice was hoarse. I didn't do this. D. Beckett wasted no time standing. Your Honor, the prosecution has overwhelming evidence. Save your arguments for the trial, Mr. Beckett. Amara interrupted, her tone calm but firm. She turned her gaze to Finch. Do you have anything to say regarding these allegations? Finch's fingers drummed against the table, his pale eyes darting toward the gallery where courthouse staff whispered among themselves. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, debating whether to jump. He stopped himself, his lips parted, then pressed together. Amara saw it instantly. Fear, not fear of the court, not fear of the charges, fear of something else. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to force silence across the room. Mr. Finch, do you believe you're being framed? Langley shifted. Beckett stiffened. Finch's breath hitched. For a moment, no one spoke. And then, yes, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of reporters scribbling furiously onto notepads. Langley stood immediately. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client. Quiet, Mr. Langley, Amara said coolly, holding up a hand. She turned back to Finch. Who is framing you? Finch swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the table. His breathing was rapid, shallow. His gaze flickered toward Beckett, then toward Langley, then toward something unseen, something only he could feel looming behind him. I can't," he choked out. "Mr. Finch," Amara pressed. "I can't," he repeated, his voice breaking. His eyes darted wildly across the room before settling on something near the back. Amara followed his gaze. Near the exit, a man in a dark suit stood motionless, arms crossed. He wasn't part of the usual courtroom staff. He wasn't a journalist. His presence sent a chill down Amara's spine. And then Finch whispered something that only she could hear. "If I talk, I'll be dead before sunrise." The witness who wouldn't speak. The moment Edward Finch whispered those words, "If I talk, I'll be dead before sunrise," the air in the courtroom shifted. The hushed whispers and frantic scribbling of reporters faded into the background, drowned out by the pulse hammering in Amara Ellis's ears. She had seen fear before, had felt it in the faces of the defendants who walked into courtrooms already knowing their fates were sealed. But this wasn't just fear. This was certainty. A certainty that told Amara Finch wasn't lying. And the man standing at the back of the courtroom, the one in the dark suit with an expression so blank it was unsettling, wasn't just an observer. He was a warning. Amara tightened her grip on the edge of the bench, eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced at the man. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, just watched. Finch's defense attorney, Langley, cleared his throat loudly, eager to move past this moment. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client is clearly under stress. If we could move forward with—" "Mr. Finch," Amara interrupted, her voice steady, "are you saying you fear for your life if you testify?" Finch's eyes darted to Langley, then Beckett, then back to the man in the suit. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I misspoke, Your Honor," he muttered. "I just meant—" "You didn't misspeak," Amara said sharply. Langley sighed loudly. "Judge Ellis, this is entirely inappropriate." "Mr. Langley, unless you have an objection based on actual court procedure, I suggest you remain silent," Amara cut in without looking at him. Her focus remained on Finch. "This court takes threats to witnesses very seriously." Beckett leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we have seen no evidence that Mr. Finch is in actual danger." "Then I suggest we find some," Amara snapped. Silence fell over the room. Finch pressed his palms against the table, exhaling shakily. His fingers trembled, though he tried to hide it by clenching his fists. Amara glanced at the bailiff. "This hearing is adjourned until further notice." The gavel struck the bench with finality. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A shadow that follows. Amara walked out of the courtroom with Valerie at her side, her assistant already scrolling through her phone, likely tracking the media response. "This is bad," Valerie muttered. "Every journalist in that room is already writing about Finch's claim. Some are calling it an erratic outburst. Others are saying—" "Doesn't matter," Amara said briskly. "What matters is that Finch is afraid. And people don't get that afraid without a damn good reason." They turned the corner into the quieter hallway that led to Amara's chambers, but she stopped abruptly when she noticed someone standing near her door. Detective Malik Carter. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened like he had been running on fumes for hours. His sharp, dark eyes flickered with something unreadable as he looked her over. "We need to talk," he said. Amara gestured toward her chambers. "Come inside." Inside, Malik barely waited for the door to close before speaking. "Finch is being followed." Amara's blood ran cold. "By who?" Malik exhaled sharply, running a hand over his short beard. "Not sure yet, but I had an officer check the security footage from last night. There was an unmarked black SUV parked outside Finch's apartment building for over 4 hours. No plates. Tinted windows." Valerie frowned. "That's not enough to prove anything." It is when you realize the same SUV was outside the courthouse today, Malik countered. Amara didn't respond. Instead, she walked over to her desk, flipping open Finch's case file once again. The charges against him weren't new. He had been in and out of the system for years. A man like that had enemies. But who had the power to keep him silent? Beckett? Langley? Or someone bigger? Amara turned back to Malik. Where is Finch right now? Malik hesitated. Protective custody. Amara's eyes widened slightly. That fast? Malik sighed. I didn't trust what I saw in the courtroom today. That kind of fear. That's real. So I pulled some strings. He's being watched by 2 officers, but we both know that won't hold if someone really wants him dead. Amara nodded. She knew better than anyone. When the system wanted you gone, it found a way. The offer. That evening, Amara sat at her desk, staring at her mother's old ID badge. The past weighed on her like an anvil, pressing deep into her bones. She was still staring when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She hesitated, then answered. A voice she didn't recognize spoke first. Judge Ellis, the voice said, smooth and calm. I'd like to offer you a deal. Amara leaned back in her chair. Who is this? The man chuckled. You don't need to know my name. But let's just say I represent certain interests that want to see Madison County's legal system run efficiently. Amara's fingers tightened around the phone. If this is an attempt at intimidation, it's not. The man cut in. It's an opportunity. You're new here, Judge Ellis. You're ambitious. But ambition has consequences. Step too far, and you'll find that the system doesn't break, it breaks you. Her grip tightened further. Let Finch go, the voice continued. You'll be rewarded for your discretion. We can make things very comfortable for you. A bribe. They weren't even trying to be subtle. Amara exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch between them before speaking. You think I took this job to be comfortable? A pause. Then, a chuckle. I thought you might say that, the voice mused. That's unfortunate. For you. The line went dead. Amara pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen. They were coming for her. She set the phone down, inhaling deeply. The fear that had flickered in Finch's eyes wasn't just about him. It was about everyone in this courthouse. This wasn't just one case. This was bigger. And now, they knew she wouldn't back down, which meant they were going to war. A system that bites back. The phone call still echoed in Amara Ellis's mind long after she had hung up. Let Finch go. It hadn't been a threat. Not exactly. It had been something worse. A warning. A quiet but unmistakable reminder that the system she had spent her whole life trying to fight wasn't just broken. It was alive. And it had just noticed her. The air in her chambers felt heavier. The faint hum of the courthouse outside her door suddenly seemed distant, muffled, like she had stepped into another world entirely. She knew what this meant. They weren't trying to scare her off yet. No, this was the first move, a test to see what kind of judge she was going to be. And if she refused to back down, the next move would be far more dangerous. She exhaled sharply, rolling her shoulders back, pushing the tension away. She wasn't backing down. A knock at her door made her straighten. Valerie stepped inside, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her expression grim. Finch is missing. Amara's stomach dropped. What? Valerie swallowed hard, her voice tight. Malik called me 5 minutes ago. The officers assigned to him lost him. A cold chill ran down Amara's spine. She grabbed her coat, already moving. A vanishing act. By the time Amara and Valerie reached the downtown precinct where Malik was stationed, the tension in the air was thick. Malik met them at the entrance, his face dark with frustration. What happened? Amara demanded as she stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Malik exhaled sharply, running a hand over his head. He slipped his detail an hour ago. Amara's hands curled into fists. How? Malik's jaw clenched. One of the officers watching him, Officer Kane, took a bathroom break. Finch said he needed a smoke. The other officer, Morales, stayed with him. But when Kane came back, Morales was knocked out cold in the alley behind the station, and Finch was gone. Valerie's mouth fell open. "You're saying someone took him?" Malik hesitated. "We don't know for sure. Could be he ran. Could be he was taken." Amara's gut told her it was the latter. Finch was afraid. If he had wanted to run, he would have done it earlier. No, someone had come for him. She exhaled slowly. "Cameras. Disabled," Malik muttered. They were down for exactly 6 minutes, long enough for Finch to disappear. Amara stared at him. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Malik agreed. They stood in silence for a moment before Valerie spoke again, softer this time. "If Finch is gone, what does that mean for the case?" Amara exhaled. "It means someone just cleaned up their loose end. A snake in the courthouse." By the next morning, the Finch case was making headlines. The local news stations ate it up. Key defendant in corruption trial missing. Judge Ellis's case in jeopardy. Mysterious disappearance sparks questions about Madison County's legal system. But it wasn't just local. National outlets had started sniffing around. And that was a problem. Because when the national media got involved, so did the politicians. By noon, Amara was sitting across from Judge Whitmore in his opulent office, staring him down while he sipped his ridiculously expensive coffee. "You're attracting too much attention," Whitmore said, placing his cup down with deliberate slowness. "That's not how things are done here." Amara didn't blink. "You mean it's not how corruption stays hidden here?" Whitmore chuckled. "You see, that's your problem. You don't know how to let things go." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Let me be clear, Judge Ellis. You're new. You don't have allies yet. You don't have power yet. But you do have enemies, and they will bury you if you keep making noise." Amara exhaled through her nose. "So you want me to just drop this?" "I want you to understand the rules," Whitmore corrected. He gestured around his massive office. "You know how I got here. I played the game. I didn't try to change the system. I mastered it. That's why I'm still standing, while others, well, they aren't." Amara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I appreciate the advice, Judge Whitmore." Whitmore smirked. "No, you don't." "No," Amara admitted, turning toward the door. "I don't." As she stepped out of his office, she made a promise to herself. She wasn't going to play their game. She was going to end it. A trap in the shadows. That evening, Malik called her with a single urgent sentence. "You need to come to the crime scene." Amara's stomach twisted. Crime scene. Warehouse district. Finch is dead. The words hit like a hammer. She barely registered hanging up before she was already grabbing her coat and rushing to her car. By the time she arrived, the warehouse was swarming with officers. Flashing blue and red lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the crime scene in sharp bursts. Malik was waiting near the perimeter, his expression grim. "Shot twice. Execution style," he murmured as she approached. "No ID. No phone. Nothing." Amara swallowed hard. Someone had silenced him, and they had made sure it was final. She stared at the covered body, her mind racing. Finch had been a liability. But more than that, he had been a message, a warning. This is what happens to people who talk. Valerie, who had arrived shortly after, swallowed audibly. "This is bad," she whispered. Amara turned to Malik. "You found anything?" Malik hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. A single note. It was stuffed in his jacket pocket." He pulled out a small evidence bag, flipping it so she could see the contents. Inside was a torn piece of paper. 5 words were scrawled across it in red ink. "The judge is next." Silence stretched between them. Valerie paled. "They're coming for you." Amara took the bag, studying the words. Not just a warning. A promise. She exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steadying as a familiar fire burned in her chest. They thought she'd back down. They thought she'd be afraid. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She turned, her voice steady, unshaken. We don't run, she said. We fight. The judge who wouldn't fall. The 5 words scrawled on the torn piece of paper burned in Amara's mind as she sat in the back seat of Malik's unmarked police car, staring out at the city lights. The judge is next. They weren't just threatening her. They were daring her. A challenge wrapped in a warning, meant to shake her resolve. But the fire in her chest only burned hotter. Finch had been silenced. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. And now, the people behind it had finally decided she was a problem. Good. Let them come. Nowhere is safe. The ride back to Amara's apartment was silent, aside from the hum of the car's engine. Malik gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. You need to be careful, he muttered as he pulled up to her building. I don't do careful, Amara said, unbuckling her seatbelt. I do justice. Malik exhaled sharply. Then at least be smart. These people aren't playing. Finch is dead. That wasn't just a hit. It was a statement. Amara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. So is staying silent. Malik cursed under his breath, but didn't argue. Valerie, who had been quiet the entire ride, finally spoke up. What's the plan, Judge? Amara didn't hesitate. We go deeper, she said. Finch was expendable. Someone else is pulling the strings. Valerie's fingers tightened around her phone. And how do we find out who? Amara glanced toward the city skyline, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. We start by looking where we aren't supposed to. A ghost in the courthouse. The next morning, Amara strode into Madison County Courthouse like she owned it. The same courthouse that had tried to keep her out on her first day. The same courthouse that was now trying to bury her. The hallways were buzzing. Word of Finch's death had spread fast. Attorneys huddled in groups, speaking in hushed voices. Clerks exchanged nervous glances. Some people avoided her gaze entirely, too afraid to be seen supporting her. She didn't care. She had a job to do. She walked straight to records and archives, a department buried deep in the courthouse, down a long hallway that most people didn't pay attention to. Inside, an older clerk with silver-rimmed glasses looked up as she entered. His name had read Harold Fletcher. Judge Ellis, he said, adjusting his glasses. To what do I owe the honor? I need files, Amara said. Old cases, ones connected to Judge Langston and D.A. Beckett. Fletcher stiffened. That's quite the request, Your Honor. Amara leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Is it a request you can fill? Fletcher hesitated. His fingers twitched against his desk, his eyes flickering toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the room. You don't want to be seen helping me, Amara observed. Fletcher exhaled sharply. It's not about not wanting to help you, Judge. It's about staying alive. That confirmed it. There was something in those files. Something people were willing to kill for. Amara placed her hands on the desk, locking eyes with him. Fletcher, you know who I am. You know what I'm trying to do. So you have 2 choices. You can either help me find the truth, or you can let these people keep controlling the system. Fletcher's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then he moved. He disappeared into the back room, leaving Amara standing in the dimly lit archive office with nothing but the sound of a rattling air vent above her. When he returned, he was carrying 2 thick folders, his hands shaking slightly. He slid them across the desk. I wasn't supposed to keep these, he murmured. Amara took the files and flipped them open. Her pulse spiked. It wasn't just Langston and Beckett. It was bigger. Judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, even businessmen. Each name had corresponding payments, bribes, transfers, payoffs for rigged cases, and one name stood out above the rest. Senator Marshall Haynes, a state senator. Amara stared at the name, realization dawning. Langston hadn't been the top of the food chain. He was just a piece of it. The real power, the real corruption. It was in the government itself. A late-night visitor. Amara barely had time to process the files before Valerie called her in a panic that evening. "Judge, you need to get out of your apartment." Amara's stomach twisted. "Why?" "I don't know who, but someone was watching your place," Valerie said, her breath coming fast over the phone. "I saw them when I was dropping off a case file." Amara glanced toward her window. The black SUV from before was parked outside. She moved. She grabbed the files, stuffing them into a satchel before throwing on a coat and heading for the fire escape. She wasn't waiting to find out who was watching. The moment she stepped outside, cold air stinging her skin, her phone buzzed. "Unknown number." She answered. "You're making dangerous choices, Judge Ellis." It was him. The man from before. The one who had tried to bribe her. She kept walking, descending the metal stairs as smoothly as possible. "And you're making desperate threats." The man chuckled. "You think you're untouchable. I think I'm still standing," Amara countered. Unlike Finch. Silence. Then, "You should know, Judge, people who try to change the system don't last long." Amara reached the ground, keeping her pace brisk as she moved through the shadows. "You should know. Neither do cowards who hide behind phone calls." The man laughed. A slow, dangerous laugh. "I'll see you soon, Judge Ellis." Then the line went dead. Amara's jaw tightened. She stuffed her phone into her pocket, heading for Malik's car parked a few blocks away. This was it. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They were coming for her directly. But they had no idea what they had just started, because Amara Ellis wasn't just another name on a list. She was the wrong judge to mess with. And this wasn't a game anymore. This was war. The judge who wouldn't fall. Amara's breath came steady as she walked through the quiet back streets of downtown, her satchel heavy with the evidence Fletcher had given her. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. She had spent years studying the system, understanding its flaws, learning how to work within it. But this wasn't the system. This was a syndicate, a machine designed to crush anyone who refused to fall in line. And now that machine had its sights set on her. She tightened her grip on the satchel. They wanted a war. She'd give them one. A silent betrayal. By the time she reached Malik's office, the detective was already pacing, his phone in one hand, a coffee cup in the other. "What the hell happened?" he asked the moment she stepped inside, slamming the door behind her. "They know," Amara said flatly. "They know I have something." She tossed the files onto his desk. Malik's expression darkened as he flipped through the pages. "This," he exhaled sharply. "This is bigger than I thought." "It's bigger than all of us," Amara corrected. She pointed to the name at the top of the list. Senator Marshall Haynes. "This isn't just about the courthouse anymore. It goes all the way up." Malik ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion palpable. "Haynes is untouchable. You get too close to a state senator, and you won't just get fired. You'll get buried." Amara didn't blink. "Then we dig him up first." Malik shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Not if we move fast." She grabbed a pen, circling several key transactions in the files. "These payments, they're all tied to cases Langston and Beckett handled. Haynes isn't just taking bribes. He's orchestrating the entire operation. He's making sure the right people get convicted, the right people get acquitted, and the right pockets get lined." Malik exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You have proof, but you don't have a way to make it stick. If you release this the wrong way, they'll discredit you before the ink even dries." Amara tapped the folder. "Then we don't release it the usual way." Malik arched an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" She took a deep breath, her pulse steady despite the storm raging around her. We go public, but not through the courts. Malik frowned. Then how? The press. His eyes widened slightly. You're serious? Dead serious, she said. We leak it to the right journalist. Make it too big to bury. Malik hesitated, staring at the files like they were a ticking time bomb. Sarah Chen, he finally said. Amara nodded. She's the best investigative journalist in the state. She's been hunting Langston's corruption for years, but she never had enough to make it stick. Malik pulled out his phone. I'll make the call. The unwanted visitor. The meeting with Sarah Chen was set for the next day, but Amara never got the chance to sleep. At 2:37 a.m., she woke to the sound of glass shattering. Her body reacted before her mind fully registered what was happening. She grabbed her phone, heart hammering, as she slid out of bed. The apartment was dark, shadows stretching across the floor as she moved silently toward the living room. Another sound, this time, footsteps. Someone was inside. Amara reached into the drawer near the couch, wrapping her fingers around the cold metal of the handgun Malik had insisted she keep. She stayed low, moving toward the sound. Then, a figure, dressed in all black, standing near the broken window. For a brief second, the intruder's face was illuminated by the glow of the city outside. He wasn't just a burglar. He was searching for something. Her files. Her stomach clenched. She moved. The moment her foot shifted, the man spun. Too fast. A gun was in his hand before she could think. Bang. The bullet ripped through the air, shattering the lamp behind her. She fired back. The gunshot echoed through the apartment as the intruder dove for cover, his shoulder jerking back. She had hit him. For a split second, Amara thought he might fight. Instead, he ran. Through the broken window, disappearing into the night. Her breath came fast, her pulse pounding. She rushed to the window, but by the time she got there, the street was empty. Only one thing remained. A small black USB drive, dropped near where the man had stood. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. What the hell had they been trying to take? Or worse, what had they left behind? The files no one was supposed to see. An hour later, Malik was sitting across from her, staring at the USB like it was a live grenade. You're saying someone broke into your place, tried to kill you, and dropped this? Amara nodded, setting her coffee down on the table. She hadn't slept, and adrenaline was the only thing keeping her upright. Malik exhaled sharply. I'll get it checked. Could be a trap. Amara shook her head. No, I want to see what's on it. Malik hesitated, then sighed. All right. He plugged the USB into his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. The moment the files loaded, his expression changed. Amara leaned in. What is it? Malik's face was pale as he turned the screen toward her. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. Video files. Hidden security footage. The first one, labeled with a date, exactly 2 weeks before Judge Langston's arrest. She clicked it. The screen flickered. Then, a boardroom. Dimly lit, filled with men in suits. And at the head of the table, Senator Marshall Haynes. Her breath caught. The audio crackled, then played. If Ellis doesn't stop digging, we remove her. Simple as that. The voices continued. She won't stop. She's got Langston's blood in the water, and she's still moving. Then we make her disappear. Like Finch. Amara's hands curled into fists. She had suspected. Now she knew. They had been planning this for weeks. Langston, Beckett, and Haynes, they were all in on it. And now, thanks to this video, she had proof. She looked at Malik. I need this leaked to Sarah Chen, she said, her voice dangerously calm. Malik hesitated. Amara, this is bigger than we thought. If this goes public, they'll come after you hard. She met his gaze, then let them. Malik exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. You're going to war, Ellis. She picked up the USB drive, gripping it tightly. No, she corrected. I already did. The fire that won't be put out. The USB drive was more than just evidence. It was a death warrant. For either her or them. Amara knew the second she released what was on it, there would be no going back. No safety. No protection. They would throw everything they had at her. She could already picture the headlines. Judge Ellis under investigation for misconduct. Judicial activist caught manipulating evidence. Madison County judge's radical agenda exposed. They would smear her, bury her, erase her. And if that didn't work, they'd kill her. She had no illusions about the stakes. But she also knew one thing for certain. They had already gone too far. Finch was dead. Langston was just a pawn. Beckett and Haynes were running the show, and they had been planning her downfall before she even stepped foot in this courthouse. Well, now it was her turn to plan. She looked across the table at Malik, who was watching her with a mix of frustration and something dangerously close to admiration. Tell me you have a strategy, he muttered. Amara exhaled. We don't go straight to the press. Malik blinked. What? She tapped the USB drive on the table. We can't just drop this in Sarah Chen's lap and hope it all works out. They'll counterattack before she even finishes writing the Dan article. Malik frowned. Then what's the play? Amara leaned forward. We divide them. Tearing the web apart. The problem with people like Beckett and Haynes wasn't just their power. It was their connections. For years, they had built a fortress of corruption, ensuring every judge, every prosecutor, every lawmaker in their pockets stayed loyal. That's why no one ever turned against them. But Amara wasn't one of them. And that meant she could break them from the inside. Malik rubbed his temples. Okay, so how do we divide them? Amara slid the USB across the table. We turn them against each other. The unraveling begins. By morning, Amara had two names. Judge William Monroe and District Attorney Celia Hastings. Monroe had been an old ally of Langston, but had never fully trusted Haynes. Hastings had resented Beckett for years, but had never had the leverage to take him down. Now she did. Amara called them both. First was Monroe. The conversation was short. Judge Monroe, I need 5 minutes of your time. I'm retired, Judge Ellis. You won't be if I release the information I have. Silence. Then, I'll see you at noon. Next was Hastings. D.A. Hastings, I have information that will put Beckett behind bars. A pause. Then, a quiet laugh. You really don't know how to quit, do you? I don't have to, Amara said coldly. Because I win. Another pause. Then, meet me in 1 hour. 2 judges, 1 decision. Amara met Monroe first. His townhouse smelled of expensive whiskey and regret. The old judge sat behind a desk lined with law books, watching her with wary eyes. Why am I here, Judge Ellis? She placed a single piece of paper in front of him. A transcript. It was from one of the recordings on the USB. Monroe's name was in it. Not as a target. As a loose end. Haynes had been planning to retire him permanently. Monroe's face paled as he read. They were going to. Yes. Amara cut in. They were going to kill you. You know how this game works, Judge. When you outlive your usefulness, you're removed. Monroe looked at her, swallowing hard. And you want what? Amara's gaze was steady. I want your testimony against Langston, Beckett, and Haynes. Monroe hesitated. Then he sighed, rubbing his face. Damn them all. The district attorney's dilemma. Hastings was next. She met Amara in a quiet bar downtown, her coat wrapped tightly around her. I have 15 minutes, she said, sitting down. Amara slid another document across the table. Bank transfers. Tied to Beckett. Hastings' eyes widened. Where did you get this? She demanded. You don't want to know. Amara said. What I need to know is, will you take Beckett down? Hastings studied the paper, then exhaled sharply. If I do this, I'm a dead woman. Amara didn't blink. If you don't do this, you'll end up like Finch. Hastings' jaw tightened. Then, after a long pause, fine, but if I go down, you're coming with me. Amara smirked. I don't go down, D.A. Hastings. The leak that broke everything. That night, Amara sent one file to Sarah Chen. Not all of it. Just enough. The next morning, the headline dropped. Judges, prosecutors, and politicians tied to private prison scandal. Investigation underway. Within 2 hours, D.A. Hastings launched a full-scale probe into Beckett's office. By noon, Judge Monroe held a press conference, confirming that Langston had manipulated trials for years. By evening, Beckett was removed from office. And Haynes, silent, waiting, watching, because he wasn't running. Not yet, which meant Amara wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The last warning. That night, Amara returned home, exhausted but victorious. The city lights outside her window were bright, reflecting off the glass. She felt it before she saw it. That eerie, crawling sensation at the back of her neck. She turned. A shadow stood across the street. A man. Watching. Waiting. Another warning. Another message. She stepped closer to the window, staring him down. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away. Amara let out a slow breath. She wasn't safe yet, but she had sent a message of her own. And she wasn't done fighting. Not until every last one of them fell.